Hey, buddy.
Hey, how you doing, John?
Good, man. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for joining me on the call.
For
What
sure,
what
man. Appreciate the invite.
what time is it where you are? Must be
6:08,
okay.
6 p.m.
So you're 12 hours behind
You're
where I am.
early.
Yeah, 6 a.m. All right. So I know we're gonna not want to stop once we get rolling, and we got an hour and a half. So why don't we just dive in? But yeah, thanks for doing this. I know you've been doing the rounds lately. I listen to a lot of podcasts and video interviews and stuff in preparation for this. So yeah, this is a funny story, but I was in bed last night, right? And like I said on Twitter, I'm super excited to speak with someone like you, because this is kind of two of my worlds converging, two of the things that I find extremely meaningful. And I was lying in bed last night, just like sleep, 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 and it reminded me of like being a kid at Christmas time, where you're just like, come on, I just want to wake up in the next morning. So yeah, I'm excited.
That's
Um,
fantastic, man. I feel the same way. Listening to some of your pods, like, okay, we have a lot of crossovers here.
yeah. So what I wanted to do in terms of getting started is maybe just look at this from how interesting the phenomenon of your recent story, right? Because I mean, it's such a funny thing that you say, hey, this one thing that I think is really interesting and cool and meaningful has a lot of similar attributes to this other thing that I think is really cool and meaningful. And then you write about that analogy, and it gets tremendously positive feedback. It gets shared, and people really appreciate that you put the time and thought and effort into explaining and making that analogy. And I thought to myself, like, what, like, why do we care so much that someone says, hey, this one thing is like this other thing? And I think one is the kind of we're all so terrified of the information asymmetry of Bitcoin, right? Like, we really want to all be as up to date as possible, and if there's another angle that somebody has brought to light, we really want to jump on it and try to understand it. But I think more than that, it's analogy and metaphor graphs onto things that perhaps are technical or complicated in various ways, and it allows us to investigate it or push our curiosity through it um, in perhaps a more easy way. And I think the reason why that's important is because if the if the graph, if the analogy is apt enough, if it's accurate enough, then we can take insights that we gain from the kind of more easy exploration of the narrative and the metaphor and bring it back and apply it to the more complicated technical thing that we're trying to understand more. So in this case, I would say it's like, well, we all want to try to understand not only the technical components of Bitcoin more, but the impact, the meaning of it, what it actually represents. And if we can graft a suitable, apt metaphor or analogy onto that, and then look at all the things in that analogy that if we can explore that analogy and then bring some stuff back so that we can expand our understanding, then I think that's perhaps why we all value this work that people like yourself are doing so much. But what's your take on that phenomenon?
Yeah, definitely. And I heard you describe the information asymmetry, sort of this fear that Bitcoiners have because no matter when you got in, you feel like you got in too late. And if you only read that one more article that would have convinced you 2 years prior, you'd be so rich that whatever, you'd need to stage a boating accident or whatever.
Right, right.
And I think that's a fascinating thought, and I never thought about it that way. But there is this insatiable appetite for content in the space. And it could be partially looking back like, hey, I made a mistake. I should have learned this stuff. But I also think there's another angle here, and that is that Bitcoiners, or if we even open it up to the greater space, what I've noticed is that most people are hyper curious. They're all self learners. They're always the guy who stayed up late digging into holes in the internet and trying to find out cool things. And so now all of a sudden you self-select for all those people and you put them together, and we just want to intellectually stimulate ourselves. And Bitcoin is the most intellectually stimulating things I've ever come across. I'm notorious for falling down rabbit holes. And usually once I get to like 90, 95% understanding, my interest falls way back. So it's like I'm not gonna dedicate the rest of my life to go to 100% here.
Right.
I already got the high of the learning curve, and Bitcoin, I find that the more I learn, the less I think I know, and that's really humbling, and it keeps me coming back to the well more and more. So that's just kind of point one on how I see information. Another thing with metaphor and stories is humans don't really grasp or retain information, just data, but we retain stories. And I think that's just a remnant of our evolutionary biology history where oral tradition was how we learned and how we remembered things. All the way back to our holy texts from Name a Religion. Those are just good stories that were originally passed down at the fire that were so good and so meaningful, even if they're allegories or whatever. But the stories persist so much that they've survived pre-internet, right? Pre-hard drive. And so, yeah, I think that that angle of storytelling is really important. Maps to metaphor also. And then the other angle I think is that biology is intuitive. We are biology. We come from biology. And so when you try to use biology as an analogy, you right away you get it. And I definitely took some leaps of faith, sort of personifying mycelium, right? It doesn't think the way that I tried to weave these stories. Like it's not exactly a human. Just like Bitcoin's not exactly a person human. It doesn't have wants and needs. Mycelium's closer to that, but you make a story and people remember.
Right. Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing, the all the different narratives and analogies and metaphors that are happening in the Bitcoin space right now. And it's so great that like you said, it's self-selecting and bringing all these like naturally curious, naturally questioning people together, and some question down a technical track, some question down a narrative and metaphor, some in all different capacities. And because as you said, how the humans learned evolutionarily, and how we retain information. I mean, it is through narrative and story primarily, right? And not only is that how we learn, but it seems that that's how we that's what things become. Things become the narrative that we create around them. And so and almost at the exclusion of whatever technical or physical reality they might have. I mean, what we believe it to be as a narrative in our mind is what it becomes, and that forms the basis of how we engage in it. And I think that's probably another reason why this whole narrative smashing is happening around Bitcoin, and we're also eager to consume up these analogies and metaphors, because we're all trying to determine as accurately as possible what this is, and then how, therefore, we're supposed to engage in it, and then what, therefore, it becomes. And then that's the evolutionary process of this thing.
Definitely. And I would also say the way our egos work is if we have an idea and we like the idea, we identify with the idea, some part of our ego is attached to this idea, then that's sort of what we cling on to, right? That's the narrative that we hold on to. And each person comes to Bitcoin with their own perspective. So if you are a pro-environment at all costs perspective, you're going to see Bitcoin as proof of works boiling the oceans. If you're a hyper-capitalist, anarchist Austrian, you're going to see, wow, we have the first example of hard money incarnate. This is really important, right? And so all those different perspectives come sloshing in. And yeah, then the narratives have their little battles, or the marketplace for ideas. I think Trace Mayer calls it. I like that.
Right. Yeah, and well, that's another great point. And it's that all these different narratives will appeal to different people in different ways. And why that's interesting is because the narrative creates that kind of gravitational pull. It piques interest. It communicates on the plane that person is on. So what's interesting about your work, and maybe you can just comment if people have approached you subsequent to writing this stuff, but saying that like people that might have been not interested or critical of something like Bitcoin previously because they're not into monetary history or economics, or they're environmentally conscious, as you mentioned. But now that you've given them a narrative that has a gravitational pull on the things that they care about, or the perspective from which they come, or the way in which they communicate, maybe you've opened the door for them. Has that been your experience in terms of feedback you've gotten?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was quite surprising. Actually, two surprises. One, I didn't think Bitcoiners were going to latch on to such a wacky idea when I was first developing these concepts. And there wasn't really much chatter about that. So when it went and all of a sudden Bitcoiners are chirping about it, and now people are taking these ideas, making them their own. I'm learning about originally my thoughts from other people who take it a new angle. It's amazing for me to get all that coming back.
Yeah.
So surprise number one. Surprise number two is I've gotten countless DMs and message on channels saying, my girlfriend never understood Bitcoin, and then I described it this way, or my mom, or my dad, or sort of the what you'd expect, the archetypal last person to understand latched onto this idea. And that to me is amazing. Because if you think about Bitcoin ecosystem, mostly we just pander to each other and maybe lob a few grenades at the Ethereans or whatever, right? And I've been saying this forever. We need to have starting points, funnels for each archetypal person.
Right.
Like we need to have the Millennials Guide to Bitcoin, the Gold Bugs Guide to Bitcoin, and just segment it off because, and I'm sure most people can relate, when you try to evangelize to your friends, family, or someone you meet at the coffee shop, you usually miss. You fall right on your face talking about some crazy ideas. But if you ask questions up front and you know their starting point, then all of a sudden I guarantee there's three hot buttons that works for them. And I think it also speaks to the fact that we don't even know what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin might be alien technology. This thing is new. It's wholly new. And I think Ralph Merkle describes it best as a digital organism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, lives and breathes on the internet. Which is an amazing paper, by the way. But considering it is that, and we barely understand it, then it also makes sense that we should humble ourselves and say, we don't know. Here's how I see it. Here's how I understand it. We're sort of in this self-discovery process. And where that will take us, I don't know. I like Jeremy Welch from Casa's quote where he says, we're just right on the edge of this thing.
Yeah.
That one stuck with me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, again, that's partially why there's so much energy and enthusiasm and interest in pursuing these narratives when they emerge, through writers like yourself, because everyone's kind of wondering, it reminds me, people probably hate this example because Facebook isn't the most popular company in the world, but in the movie The Social Network, when they're in their dorm room and they're talking about like raising funds or whatever, Zuckerberg just says like, no, we can't do any of that yet because like we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is really. Like we know we've launched this website and people can see pictures of their friends and stuff, but like we don't know what that means really. So we shouldn't be out there. We don't want to say that what it is or that we know what it is prior to understanding it better. And I think that's part of the reason why we're all so eager to consume these narratives, these analogies, this stuff, and put them through our own meat grinder and try to see if they're valid and if they're not, and try to allow it to give us more insight into what this thing really is. And one of I have a very poorly thought out and even more poorly articulated thought about Bitcoin. There's a lot of religious analogies to Bitcoin, right? And the ultimate apex of religion or spirituality is some concept of truth, right? And the truth is very difficult to define, but it's this pure thing that probably can transmute itself into everything. A real, genuine truth can be transmuted through all things and represented in all things. And I'm taking a bit of license here, and the people, and only the hardcores will probably be nodding their head, but Bitcoin is starting to appear to be something really truthful and pure, and as a result, I'm starting to see that a lot of analogies work. Some fit better than others, and I absolutely love yours, and I think attribute for attribute, it really lines up well. But you can compare so many things to something that has kind of a truthful center, and I feel like that's what's happening. But if you want to describe Bitcoin as a virus, as a plant, as the sun, as a religion, as a philosophy, as a mycelial network, it works. You can find a way to make it fit.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think truth is an interesting point, and I think that's fundamentally what it does. It sort of crowdsources truth, and it's not objective truth. It's just relative truth. It's like, I'm not sure who wrote this. I'm forgetting the author, but it's essentially Bitcoin is a decentralized clock.
Hmm.
And each block is 1 unit of time. And all you can know for certain is that the order of operations, unit by unit, block by block, is objectively true. And you can measure that down to the thermodynamic truth of, dollars spent or hashes spent, energy consumed, however you want to look at it. I think that's fascinating because that is sort of the truth. You're paying all this upfront cost to have the most fundamental unit of truth. And if we have that, what can we build on top of it? And I think that's where things start to get really weird because in some sense, Bitcoin is just a secure, cryptographically secure messaging system, right? That's really all it is.
Right.
But then you look at it from another angle, those messages we now value. Okay, now we can measure in Bitcoin time instead of our atomic clocks. What else could it be? I have no idea.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that like you said, you in the rabbit holes you've gone down in the past, you go 95% of the way and think, okay, I mostly got this thing. But with the Bitcoin one, it's almost like, if it's a star collapsing in on itself, it's keeping on going down. So you got to keep following it with it to keep trying to see how it morphs and changes and how the understanding changes. And it's difficult to keep up, but I think the reason why we're all here is because it's such a compelling intellectual pursuit because it seems to have no end, not only in the ways in which we can relate it to other things and understand it better, but as you just mentioned, like all those different details of it that aren't the initially apparent use cases, right? We take that the messages, as you say, and we say they have value because there's a limited supply and we need a way to exchange and send, and store value, and this is a great initial use case. But yeah, perfect example. Like, how will we realize the value of a universal clock in the future, and how will we use that? It's that's why
Definitely.
we're all here.
I also one more point to add on to that in terms of intellectual pursuits. I think that most of the controversy, the infighting, the general tribalism that we see in the space is because people get to a certain level of understanding and then they say, oh, I got it. I know what Bitcoin is. And they made up their mind. And then 2 years later, or they just peek around the other corner and Bitcoin's actually changing, it's different, or they didn't fully grasp it. And you can see this with examples like fast, cheap payments, right? That was an early narrative that dragged on and led to the apex of the SegWit battle. And so I think if everyone took a healthy dose of humble, we would maybe not make up our minds so quickly and realize that this thing is bigger and more interesting than we thought. Stranger than we can suppose.
Terrence McKenna.
That's right.
Nice. I want to get into that a bit later, but Bitcoin has been related to various forces of nature, or kind of organized in a similar way to nature itself. And I think I've heard you discuss, the patterns in nature and how they repeat themselves over and over. And I think this is one of the things that makes Bitcoin compelling, and perhaps why people relate it to being an organism, because I agree. I think on every scale of nature, you see very similar patterns. And now they may not be apparent unless you exit one scale and look from another scale to a lower or higher scale. And then that's where you see the patterns. And so it kind of lends itself to understanding nature in a sort of fractal way, in which one pattern nestled within another, and you kind of ask yourself, well, why does it occur that way? Both naturally, as in the natural world. I mean, humans are natural, but both in the non-human world, and somehow in the way that we take ideas from our head and create them in the physical world, those patterns seem to be coming through us as well in the things that we create. And I think Bitcoin is one. It's very apparent with Bitcoin that we've created another organism, force of nature, whatever you want to call it, that has these similar patterns as we find on various other scales in nature. And one very perhaps overly simplified example is you make the connection with the mycelial network, obviously. And then if you look at the way that the Bitcoin network is distributed, with if you could visualize it, you look at the mycelial networks, you look at nodes on the Bitcoin network, or even now starting with the Lightning Network, you look at the deep space image of how, you know, galaxies and stars are together. You look at the neuronal connections in the brain, and you look at 4 or 5 of these pictures, and you say, that looks like the same organizing principle to me. And, you know, I don't really have a point here. It's just interesting that we continue to, that these very fundamental things continue to be represented in the same sort of patterns.
Definitely. Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there. And I think the one that sticks out the most for me, Mycelium is just the one that I understand the most. I think it's the most easy to grasp with relation to Bitcoin. But the most fundamental thing here is that this network archetype persists. It's really old. It's billions and billions of years old. And so what that speaks to me is a fundamental organizing principle of nature. Mm-hmm. And these networks persist because they're effective. And okay, we go zoom way out. You see the super galaxy clusters. Linnea is organized this way. Dark energy, dark matter is organized this way. And then you get down to all the human scale stuff. And now all of a sudden, humans are creating technologies that mimic this network archetype. And I think the internet is the easiest one to grasp. People have compared Mycelium to the internet, Terence McKenna as well. Right. And yeah, we just create this entity that is of us, but it's not really us. It almost has its own essence. And the internet is so robust because this network archetype is so robust. We're just mimicking nature. It's essentially biomimicry in a really effective scale. And when you look at the internet, you really can't kill the internet, right? It's too ingrained. And there's so much surface area. And the same is with Bitcoin. It's infiltrating all aspects. You can't kill it. And every day that goes by, it infiltrates more and more. And it speaks to the robustness, the anti-fragility, just the ability for this thing to persist. And it can pay people to do its bidding. It hijacks our consciousness and employs all these volunteers who drop out of their careers to go just read Bitcoin articles. Like, it's insane. The intellectual horsepower here is mind-blowing. I met some of my favorite people on the planet in the last 2 years just by talking about Bitcoin and bumping into Bitcoiners.
Yeah, it's a tremendous phenomenon, man. Everything you just said, I totally agree with. And, you know, I thought about when people criticize it, or when quote-unquote competitors try to emerge, you know, even if they can't recreate many of the different attributes and organizing principles that you just mentioned, but like, I often think, you realize that like the people contributing to Bitcoin, whether they're developers, educators, all this kind of stuff, most of them, at least at the beginning, did it for like it's voluntary. They were like, this thing needs to exist and develop, and I have a certain skill set, and I'm going to devote it to it because I feel like it's right and good and truthful and meaningful. You can't fuck with that. I don't know, like if you're a hierarchical company, you know, you a typical organized company and project, you can't outlast that, even if you're in some ways better or more competent. I mean, because that thing will just, I mean, it'll be around forever as long as people continue to think it's meaningful and believe that it can be better, and they can contribute to it. I mean, it's absolutely stunning the I guess the kind of social pull that it has, that it's just pulling these people in and saying, contribute to me, build me, blah, 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 and I'll reward you, you know? And not just financially, but like, what is, so many people around the world today, myself previously being one of them, find themselves in, you know, jobs that are varying degrees of meaningless to them. Now, some find themselves in ones that are a bit more fun. Others find themselves in one that, because of the level of compensation, they're willing to, you know, stomach it, or whatever the case may be. But you know, I've held this opinion for a long time. No matter how healthy I was physically, no matter how, you know, well screwed on my head was, no matter psychedelic practices, nothing is more important than waking up in the morning and thinking, I'm excited for today. I mean, that is it. That is the ultimate goal. And if you can engage in something that delivers that to you, notwithstanding, of course, it's going to be hard and challenges and pressure and stuff, but if you can at least wake up and say, like, man, I'm excited to engage today, that is the ultimate goal and the ultimate gift. And I'm a bit of a hyperbole here, but I don't think too much to say that a lot of people that are starting to find their way to Bitcoin and starting to find a way in which to contribute, even again, if no compensation initially, it's an amazing social phenomenon that it's giving that to people. It's providing that opportunity to start changing how they live and interact with the life and the work that they do. I mean, and that's going to have so many beneficial effects.
Totally. It's a rallying cry for revolutionaries, right? The millennials are probably the most predominant group here. And we were sold this bill when we were younger that participation matters. You get to follow your dreams. You're all special. Go do your thing. And then we go to high school, to go to college, and we get our jobs, and we're like, wait a minute. We were told life was way cooler than this. I've got massive student debt. My boss is an idiot. I don't agree with the company. No one values my opinion. And this is kind of slamming millennials, which I'm a part of. But then we're like, well, that's not good enough. Let's do van life. Let's be digital nomads. Let's get into yoga. Let's essentially buck the trend. Let's push back on what mainstream culture means and try to find meaning elsewhere. And, I spent 5 years traveling and working, digital nomadism, whatever. It's cool. It has benefits, but it doesn't solve these existential problems of meaning. For many people, it makes it worse.
Yeah.
And so what Bitcoin is, at least for a lot of people and partially for myself, it's a cause worth fighting for. It's enough meaning there that I can latch onto that I do feel like my work is important.
Yeah.
And it sort of collects disenfranchised brains and, puts a rifle in their hand and pats them on the butt and sends them off.
Yeah.
And we all share that rebel spirit, right? The fuck the man, whatever. I think a lot of Bitcoiners have that.
Sure. Absolutely. And I love that, that analogy. But I think you're right. I've talked about it a bit on the podcast, and I don't fault. I mean, I'm in that category too, and I did that as well. Travel around, try to find meaning in anything else. Like, okay, this isn't working. Where is meaning? Is it in health? Is it in yoga? Is it psychedelics? Is it, relationships? Is it some other form of work? Is it environmentalism? Whatever. And so I don't knock them because it's a noble journey to extricate yourself from something that is not working, that is tearing you apart inside, and go on that hero's journey of trying to find something more meaningful. It's just that, in the world, I mean, this is too much, but in the world prior to Bitcoin, it wasn't as obvious what that might be. And like, of course, I don't mean to insinuate that I don't derive meaning from many other aspects of my life. My friend and family relationships, and my physical body and other pursuits, but few tick as many boxes as something like Bitcoin, and few have the ability to scale that meaning and push it through society and make it available to so many other people as something like Bitcoin. And few represent the degree of kind of the size of the weapon, as the analogy you made, in society to disrupt a lot of the things that I think we'd all mutually agree are probably need upgrading, to put it lightly, in society as much as Bitcoin. It's fine to focus on the relationships you have in your life and living in a beautiful environment and stuff, but that doesn't fix like a lot of the other issues that are counter to the things that you want to see in the world. This weapon, quote unquote, does provide that, and I think that's why we're all motivated to engage in it.
Definitely. And we also, it sort of starts with the individual. If you engage with Bitcoin long enough, and this has a lot of religious undertones,
yeah.
But you start going to communion, you tithe Bitcoin for stacking sats Saturday, and all of a sudden your values are influenced. For
Yeah.
many people, they report they totally changed their life. I don't blow money at the bar anymore. I stack sats.
Right.
Shifting time preference. How do you value your money? How do you value your time? These things start to change. And so, yeah, there's this feedback loop with Bitcoin where it feels good. You're actually seeing change. You have accountability partners online.
Yep.
And yeah, whatever little way you can fit in feels valuable. It's
And
truly incredible.
it forces you, or helps you generate clarity around what your unique contribution could be. But until you have something that you think is meaningful enough to extract from you your full effort, then you won't really try to determine what your full effort looks like or what it can be. So I think when we encounter those things that we believe to be meaningful, then we start to ask ourselves, okay, this is serious business now. What gets me off? What's my unique ability, talent, contribution, whatever, potential, and how do I channel that to plug in or to contribute to this thing? And so where you might have been wandering around before, or who cares, it's a comfortable job, it's a this, it's a that, I think a lot of people are being pressed, motivated now to say, okay, I got, this thing is legit as fuck. I gotta approach it with, my genuine self and my best self, to be a bit cheesy, and how, I'm not going to be a core developer, perhaps. I'm not going to be, a writer, perhaps, or whatever it is. What can I uniquely contribute, or what can I start refining within myself that will allow me to contribute in a meaningful way? And I see that happening throughout the space in diversified ways, and it's fucking awesome. I love to see it.
Totally agree.
Yeah. All right. One thing I wanted to discuss, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in most of the interviews and writing that you've done, you haven't, in the mycelium analogy, you haven't discussed much the psychedelic component of, mushrooms, mycelium. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've definitely made some references. I've left Easter eggs for those who could find them.
Right.
And I would say in the second article, when I talk more about the social layer of Bitcoin, I do talk about how there are religious tones to Bitcoin, and how also there's a lot of religious tones to mushrooms.
Yeah.
And where ancient man who partnered with mushrooms found themselves in a much better situation. Mm-hmm. And that could be simply because they make good food, or they can be used as medicine, to sharpen tools, to transport fire. Also because psychedelic mushrooms do provide evolutionary advantageous tools to humans.
Right.
The stoned ape theory comes to mind. I'm sure you're quite familiar. And, Paul Stamets, I saw him speak recently at Burning Man, and he had a nice bit about how mushrooms make you, psychedelic mushrooms make you less fearful. And they also make you a little bit more courageous and a little bit more community oriented. Mm-hmm. And those are leadership qualities. And so ancient man also acquired leadership qualities. Their eyesight was better. They found more food. Not to mention, as people know, higher dose psychedelic experiences open the floodgates to novelty, and information starts streaming in. And if you envision man on the sub-Saharan African plains leaving his homeland in the trees and all of a sudden downloading new information, that's going to be really helpful in his path towards survival in a changing climate world. And so, yeah, I've sort of dabbled on it. What I was cautious of is I don't want these ideas to be clouded by the judgments that people have surrounding psychedelics. It's a very charged topic.
Yeah.
I've personally talked about my use in various capacities, but not a lot. But I think that's starting to change. And if we want to jump into that, I'm happy to go on my little rant here.
Hit me, man.
So I think, first of all, if anyone's considering this topic or how to approach it, is know that the media stuff is nonsense, right? The information being fed from our media has never really been the whole truth for any topic. So start with a clean slate. When you look at these things, start with an open mind. Humans have been using them for thousands of years, and the main classic psychedelics like psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, DMT, they mimic our same neurotransmitters that we have in our body. So essentially, nature produces a molecule that looks just like serotonin. It fits lock and key with our brain. They're extremely safe, like 10,000 times safer than aspirin, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so know that they're physically safe for your body. They do change your consciousness in some capacity. You don't see magical things. It's nothing crazy like that. But I think we need to just be open about these as tools and approach them for what they are. And if you look all over the place, people are coming out of the psychedelic closet. The Tim Ferrisses, the thought leaders, intellectual leaders that we support, are all saying that these things have changed their lives for the better, myself included. And yeah, I just think that's a good starting point, is that they're good for your body, and if they're used responsibly, they can be profound tools for change. And some analogies I like would be, it's like a computer reset button. You sort of defrag your mind. You go through all that chatter, that clutter, that unfinished business, and you have time to be introspective and sort of re-compartmentalize your life in a way that doesn't have that strong emotional attachment. You're not averting these hard feelings. You can just sit with them and reorganize them. Yeah, that's probably a good mouthful to start with.
Yeah, and I think what's great is that, because this has been true for a long time, but as we know, the 60s happened and there was a lot of fallout from the way in which they were approached during that time. And I don't fault those, young people that much, because they were coming out of the 40s and 50s. I mean, that was a world that we can't even comprehend in terms of its rigidness, let's say. I mean, the world today is a very fluid, accepting, open sort of place. Back then, it was conform, pretty much, And so to drop this substance into the minds of people back then, I don't fault them too much for reacting or responding the way that they did. But what I love about today is that over the last 20 years, the research has reemerged. And little by little, people have been able to conduct this research at really world-class institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London and various other institutions. And it's bringing a high degree of scientific rigor and legitimacy to this space, which is great, because you don't have to be tie-dyed freak saying you spoke to God anymore. You can say, hey, these things are proving to be the most effective substances for treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, anxiety, mood disorders, and that's just a really good start. Not saying you have to have those, but it's just saying, look, these things are serious business. And further to that, I think most people's, if they've ever tried psychedelics, they probably tried them in a recreational capacity when they were younger with some friends and had a giggle fest and that sort of thing. And I'm not into that. I think that they should be used very carefully, because they do dramatically change your consciousness. So I think they should be used as they have been used historically, which is sacramentally. So if you're going to use something sacramentally, it means you take a lot of care and planning into this experience. You be very careful for who and how many people are with you and your environment and all those different considerations, because it will untether you from your normal consciousness, and that can be unsettling. And you need to have as much kind of comfort and confidence going into that experience as possible in order to get the most out of it. And it's absolutely not exclusively a wonderful, happy experience. In fact, you hear a lot about bad trips, and I don't believe in that concept. I think there's resistance. I think that's what a bad trip is you're resisting something that's trying to be shown to you, or a realization that that you're having. And if you resist it because you believe it's supposed to be otherwise, or it's too painful, or whatever, then it's going to be a very difficult time. If you're open to it and say, well, what's behind this? What is this fear all about? What is this anxiety all about? It gives you an opportunity to go beyond the veil and try to really see causes for that. Now, maybe those causes are represented in metaphor, or maybe they're represented in a vision. But if you stay open and stay courageous in these experiences, successive doors continue to open until you arrive at this place, which is as I'm sure you know, indescribable, and has a lot of potential benefits. Not even for people that are sick, but for well individuals. And the reason why I relate it so much to something like Bitcoin is because, and I'm sure we could, feel free to expand on this, but very simply put, Bitcoin is a means of attaining, among other things, a means of attaining physical sovereignty, financial sovereignty. That's one of its core components. And for me, psychedelics are about attaining sovereignty of consciousness, because it allows you to become more acutely aware of your conditioning, of your subconscious emotional responses, and all the different things that you pick up through life, and they kind of they cement in your mind, or they become latent, or they become subconscious drivers. And psychedelics allow you to, for lack of a more simplistic term, see things clearly for the first time. And once you can do that, you can take back your conscious sovereignty from all the different influences, family, nation state, media, friends, society, culture, that have influenced it as you emerged in the world and have grown up and gone through it. You're then able to, and that's painful, right? It can be, because all of that stuff, we adopt it because it makes life easier, makes life more comfortable, makes our maneuvering through culture easier, less friction. And when you take back your conscious sovereignty, then you have to rebuild it kind of from the ground up. And that's what we're doing with Bitcoin as well, right? We have this tool to take back financial and physical sovereignty, but we are having to build it from the ground up, because the culture and the system is not set up for using a tool like that. And so I really see a ton of overlap here. And as one of the things, I guess, that I'm hoping my influence might be in the space, and I only bring it up when appropriate, but I just imagine this. A lot, how you mentioned, a lot of us Bitcoiners try to explain it to people, and a lot of times it falls on deaf ears, and that's why you're saying we need to really expand the kind of analogies we use and where we meet people on whatever level they're at, to try to have that gravitational pull start pulling on them. I think, imagine if you could tell a Bitcoiner, like, hey, there's this other thing out there in the world that is as equally difficult to explain, but is as equally as powerful and impactful, as meaningful as you find Bitcoin. And it's out there right now. And when I'm explaining it to you, you got to give me the benefit of the doubt that it's the same thing you feel when you're explaining Bitcoin to somebody else. That's how I feel when I'm trying to explain this thing to people, because it's like one of those things that you can't accurately convey it in its totality. So, anyways, long-winded way of saying, I think they're very similar in that the kind of meaning and impact they represent, and the sovereignty in different capacities, physical and conscious, that they could convey if properly used.
I think that's fantastic what you just described. The parallels are astute. I think that one's gonna land. And what initially came up to me, a couple things. One, I want to address the skeptics for a second, the people who say, my mind works fine, I don't need this, I am doing okay, I'm successful. Go sit down and try to meditate for 10 minutes. Just sit down, shut up, and don't think. And you'll probably last about 7 seconds, and then your mind will start racing. 2 minutes will go by, and you'll be like, oh shit, I thought I was supposed to not think. Right? Just as a simple exercise, pause and go do that. And what do you learn from that? You learn that your mind, you don't have as much control over your mind as you think. And if you allow your mind to just run its mouth all day long and chirp in your ear, you're being driven by something that is not you. And I know that's a hard concept, but your mind is not you, right? Your mind is a part of you. Mm-hmm. And so in the same way that we don't really understand Bitcoin's true value from a financial aspect until you understand what's wrong with the current system, you can't really understand the power of psychedelics until you understand what's wrong with our current minds, right, and what we pollute them with and how we allow them to drive us. And so, yeah, sound mind, sound body, if you want to use that kind of terminology, you need to have both. If you're simply sovereign over your physical realm, but you're in your mind, you're a prisoner, that's not going to lead to a fulfilling life, even if you have 6.15 Bitcoin.
Nice, nice. Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. So it's about pursuing sovereignty in all capacities, in all areas, right? Not just in the one. Um, have you completed part four yet? It's not published, right?
Correct. So part three, I wrote and it was like 5,000 words, so I had to break it into two parts. It's sitting as I would say 70% complete draft. I'm just not finding much time to write recently. And I think, I got married a few days ago, and so hopefully
Congratulations.
this fall, thanks, man. This fall and winter, I'm live in Minnesota now after 5 years of traveling, and we have bad winters. So usually the winter is when I huddle in and get a little bit more of my writing done.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's sitting on the shelf.
And so, can you share kind of the angle that you're going to be taking with it?
Yeah, definitely. So it's essentially, and it's actually timely with Giroux's new piece on Bitcoin as space money. But the essential concept is let's assume hyper Bitcoinization happens, and we now share this one global money, cleans up the financial markets, etc. What kind of speculation can we look downstream? What is the real effect of this thing? And a lot of it's drawing on the concept of social scalability. So essentially just scaling our ability as humans to coordinate. And I see a glass ceiling right now where we're sort of stuck in this nation state battle where we are part of nations who war over resources. And fundamentally, there are scarce resources, so we each fight for them. And I see Bitcoin as a way to shatter that glass ceiling and enable cooperation on a more global scale. And this could mean I also subscribe to the sovereign individual thesis where we'll fracture into smaller nation states, a little bit more specialized nation states. And without this overhead of these big corporations slash governments sort of driving the ship, I do see a future with more, more scalability, more cooperation, go to space, actually implement changes led by the free market to make life better for humans, unlocking intellectual capital from people who are currently not participating in the global financial system. Just sort of pontificating on those, and I'll try to weave in as much mushroom knowledge as I can find on the topic. Jeroen Bansal from Unchained Capital, maybe you saw his piece recently about post hyper Bitcoinization, how does Bitcoin head into the stars? And I would love to make one comment on that. I'm a massive fan of Drew and his article, and we've been talking over email about it, and it gets me really excited. But the most interesting thing that I took away is that there's this fundamental problem with humans exploring other stars. So space is really big, and it's pretty conceivable that in the next 100, 200 years, we'll colonize our solar system, assuming everything goes as planned. But leaving our solar system to go to the nearest star is really far away. Even if we can travel really fast, it's still going to require cryogenic sleep. And essentially what that means is you're taking a massive risk to pop out on the other end and probably die. But there's not much reward even if you do survive. So what? You're the first guy to put a flag at another planet and you live this horrible life and you say goodbye to everyone you know. That's not a very good incentive. However, if the first person to arrive at a new star or a new planet is far enough away from Bitcoin's field of hash, you essentially are the first person to seed a new proof of work currency, more or less an updated version of Bitcoin somewhere else. And then you get to be the Satoshi who mines the early blocks in a new place. And if your risk pays off, you also become extremely wealthy. So now all of a sudden, people are going to line up, load them in those ships and shoot them everywhere. And now there's an incentive. So I thought
Yeah,
that was a fun thought.
exploring new worlds for the chance of being Satoshi. Yeah,
Totally.
you never know, man. The future is going to be, like you said, stranger, and Terrence said, stranger than we can suppose. So it's all just fun speculation at this stage. But one of the things you said, I was actually out for a run yesterday, and a lot of people in the Bitcoin space will often talk about one of the reasons why it's important to get on a different monetary standard is because governments throughout history have abused their control over the money supply and the monetary standard to conduct war, right? This has happened throughout history. And as a result of doing that too much, and a result of abusing that power, the money supply, the monetary system is always debased. It's either, metal coins were debased, or the currency is inflated, or too much debt is taken on and there's eventually a collapse. One of those three or all of them. But you could make a very strong case that in the 20th century and ongoing, the ability for the state to wage war has been amplified tremendously by basically them having an endless supply of money, because most countries have central banks, and yes, they have to manage the currency so that it stays in a band in comparison with other international currencies, but they can more or less print as much as they want, or certainly enough to wage wars on countries that are, far smaller economically. And I don't know if this holds up at all, so I just wanted to get your take on it. But aside from a non-manipulatable monetary standard being used, and therefore not being able to have an endless supply of funds to fund a war effort, i.e. using a hard money like Bitcoin, but I was wondering if the use of fiat money also promotes war in another way, in that if we don't have, because I saw war as a proof of work, a type of proof of work. Because when I was a kid, I used to think or you're talking with your buddies, you're like, man, why is there wars? Why don't they just put the president of one country and the president of another country, put them in a ring, duke it out, and whoever wins, wins, right? And whoever wins, wins the dispute. And well, the answer is because then the loser will be like, well, no, I can put up a better fight, right? I can collect the collective resources and capacity and productive capacity of my nation and put it towards this effort. And then we're really seeing, okay, all your ability to do work, right? Your proof of work, collect all your citizenry, your natural resources, your productive capacity, everything. You put it on the table, I'll put mine. That's the only way we're really going to solve this and see who is the more powerful, who is the victor. And I was so I was like, wow, war is a certain type of proof of work. And, does the prevalence of war, the frequency, increase or basically, do we outsource proof of work to war if we don't have it in our money? So if we have a money that doesn't accurately or actually represent work, if it can just be kind of, printed, taken out of thin air, then do we have to outsource the real proof of work to war? And if we went back to a money that actually did represent proof of work, if we did actually have to devote a very specific and knowable amount of resources to obtaining this money, and then it could not be manipulated or altered in any way, would we then not have to engage in the proof of work of war as often, because the proof of work, our productive capacity and the resources that we can bring to bear are literally represented in the money that we control? Discuss. I can't hear you.
There we go.
Yeah.
I put myself on mute. I'm in a sit-stand desk. I went from standing to sitting.
Okay.
Couple interesting points you had there. First one, sort of the idea where why don't the two kings fight each other and that solves it, sort of like the duel of champions instead of lose lives on the battlefield.
Right.
I think throughout history that happened occasionally, but I think it was mostly when two armies are very similar in size and there's not a clear winner. Because if you're obviously the superior army, you would never risk the chance that your champion loses. Right. But super interesting thought there with sort of skin in the game and a way to save lives and solve the conflict. Going back to money and war, what I find interesting there is that if money is scarce and you can't print it from a government's perspective, then essentially you have to collect money somehow. You have to fundraise to actually pay with purchasing power instead of funny money, pay with purchasing power for war, which is really expensive. And so instead of being able to do that, you have to most likely collect taxes from your people in some capacity. And so the individuals actually feel that war, the cost of war, which if everyone understood what the true cost of the Middle East war for the United States was, I don't think anyone would have voted for it. In the same way where people say, hey, let's bring back the draft, because if the people who financially benefit from war, if their son has a chance to go to war because it's just a drawing, then maybe people wouldn't want to go to war, right? As soon as you actually feel the burden, then humans are a little bit less interested. And so I think a Bitcoin world would decrease our ability to wage war, at least on the same scale. However, I think there's another thing here where I think war is changing. And to go to your point about how either you have proof of work in the money or proof of work in the army, I think that's super interesting. And I think that the proof of work in the army is now changing from the magnitude of your army to the sophistication of your technology. Mm-hmm. So things like cybersecurity and Stuxnet and hacking and economical warfare, which is what the US is predominantly doing, or like what the Soviet Union and Russia are known for, which is the psychological warfare. I think that's sort of the war of the future. And so what's tricky is I think these wars are going to be going on, but they're going to be a little bit more covert. And I don't know how expensive they're going to be going forward, because where we're going to end up is that defense through things like cryptography. Now the defender has the advantage. So small microstates theoretically could defend themselves through superior technology, whether it's drones or anti-aircraft things very cheaply, or the ability to hack, the ability to retain their money, the ability to communicate secretly. All those things give the defender an advantage. And that all kind of maps nicely to the thesis in the sovereign individual. But I guess the long story short is that I think war is changing. Bitcoin eliminates war or decreases war, or at least requires the government to pay the full cost, which should decrease war.
Right, but it's also another reason why there'll be resistance from the incumbents, right? Because they'll fully realize, or do fully realize, that would represent a extremely significant check on their power, right?
Absolutely. I think they're too arrogant at this point to assume Bitcoin means anything, at least threatening from their perspective. And they're probably right? $200 billion, it's tiny. It is nothing. But I think slowly people are waking up to the zeitgeist, or the reality of the zeitgeist that includes Bitcoin now. It's in the cultural conversation.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to speculate, because it's, as they say, first slowly, then all at once. It's this thing where just a bunch of geeks and nerds and all these people that we've been discussing come together and think this is really cool, and it's dismissed, and as with you make the analogy with the mycelial network, kind of just operating underground, moving around resources, waiting, biding its time, and then at some point that's almost impossible to predict, the conditions are right, and the mushrooms burst out of the ground with extreme force, say, hey, we're here now, and then they disappear again, and that's kind of the growth cycle of Bitcoin. But I guess in this analogy, the point is just that it's nothing until it's really something.
Definitely, and I think that's the timing of Bitcoin is really, really important here. It was born out of the last financial crisis. All the metaphors, all the early adherents support this idea, and the macro conditions couldn't be more perfect. Each time these nation states fuck up, Bitcoin's there like, great, we will offload this demand. Okay, this needs to happen. Great. Now information travels through the Bitcoin ecosystem, and we need to build something to now do this other thing because our current system's failing. And I think the best case scenario is we just MMT ourselves into the ground, and slowly over time, Bitcoin absorbs this, and the parallel system eventually eclipses the dollar regime. And I think that would make a better world, right? If the transition's fast, it's going to be bad for a lot of people.
Totally. I couldn't agree more.
But if the transition's slow and, it's just bit by bit, I think that's going to be a huge win for humanity.
Yeah, I agree. I've mentioned it a couple times, but a fast, jarring transition really doesn't serve the majority of people. It'll be real ugly and really disruptive and cause a lot of pain. But if we can just have this little tugboat kind of traveling side by side, and we're building it out and building it out, when the time comes, you just jump ship, then that would certainly be a smoother transition. And I think in everyone's best interest. And the other thing with this stuff is we paint it as an ideological or other type of battle between like the state and the government and free individuals. But obviously most people, even that operate in the government, are people just like you and I, right? We like to hang out with our friends and family and have good relationships and do work that's meaningful. It's just that we've all wound up in different places in society and culture. I try to be careful with the kind of adversarial attitude, right? Because at the end of the day, this will serve everybody. I don't get to choose who it serves. It'll serve everybody. I think it has the potential to benefit everybody. And, ultimately we're all in this together. We don't want to have a situation where there's winners and losers, because then losers try to come back and be winners again. We want to have a situation where we paint this as something that ultimately, despite perhaps some discomfort, perhaps a change in perspective and things of that nature, that benefits everybody. So, and I get involved in it too sometimes, because the David versus Goliath sort of attitude grabs you, and you're like, we got to beat down this big monolithic thing. But that's not exactly the case.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also important to note that Bitcoin doesn't lead to a kumbaya scenario. What Bitcoin is just the rules are fair. The rules are upfront. The rules are open. And this provides opportunity, or an equal opportunity, right? Instead of an equal outcome. There is no equal outcomes. We don't want that.
Right.
And so if the rules are fair, they're upfront, they're really hard to cheat and change. Special interests have a hard time co-opting Bitcoin. We've seen this demonstrated. I think that's going to continue. That's the most important thing of Bitcoin. The assurances are near guaranteed. And if that continues, then great. We have a new measuring stick for value. And the more value you create, the more money you get, and you get to keep your money. It doesn't disappear.
Yeah, I agree. And this comes up sometimes with the distribution of Bitcoin, right? The people that were involved early on, Satoshi, and early people that were mining, and people saying like, well, isn't this unfair? Certain people have a huge portion of the money supply. And I understand that criticism, because those people will have an inordinate amount of power and influence if this becomes a global monetary standard. But it's not like it wasn't fair. These people had the curiosity and the intellectual capacity and took the risk to be involved with their time or their resources early. I mean, what would have been more fair? Giving every man, woman, and child the same amount? Like, I don't think that would have been a more beneficial outcome. And it wouldn't have allowed for it to grow anyways.
And even if you did give the equivalent of Bitcoin per person, most people would get rid of it immediately. Other people would lose it because they don't value it. And you'd end up right back with the same ideological motivated people in the beginning collecting it all.
Yeah.
Right? Until it had value, you're really just playing an ideological game.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is the most fair money we've ever had. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Did Satoshi try really hard to make it as fair as possible? I think so. I think every coin after Satoshi, in no fault of their own, but they can't make it as fair.
Right.
Because the genie's out of the bottle. And, I got into some fights with some Ethereans recently about the genesis of Ethereum versus Bitcoin. And their position is essentially that Ethereum did as good of a job as they could have making their distribution fair. And I think that's probably true. They did have a pre-mine. The founders created money out of thin air and sold money before there was anything to sell. So there's some critiques there, but under the circumstances, they made a fair shot.
Yeah.
But even if it was the most fair at the time, it's nowhere near as fair as Satoshi's launch.
Yeah.
And so,
well, as you say, the genie's out of the bottle, and that amazing Hayek quote where he says, some sly roundabout way, you only get one shot at it, right? So that sly roundabout way, the cherry on the top would have him saying, "But it'll only happen once." That would have been really prescient of him. But I mean, it was already extremely prescient. But yeah, I think you're right. So I don't think it could have happened differently. Brandon, I'm going to break into the rapid fire stuff now, unless you have anything else you want to break into first.
Only the one point that I keep trying to stress right now is that biology is technology. We are of biology, but biology has already solved all the design problems, all the engineering problems. So if you're stuck on a hard problem, look to nature. And if you have the right tools to understand what's going on around you, they're probably going to find some answers to the hard problems that we already have.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking for other perspectives or way of articulating and seeing things, just to kind of shake up your own understanding or your traditional ways of understanding things, Terence McKenna does talk about that a lot, that technology is nature, we are nature, and a lot of very interesting concepts around those things. And he's just, possibly the best orator ever. He's extremely compelling to listen to, and I don't know if many in the Bitcoin community are familiar with him, probably more than I assume, but if you're looking for a different way of looking at technology, then he's got some great talks.
Wholeheartedly agree. He has the best grasp of the English language out of anyone I've ever come across.
Yeah. All right, man. I don't know if you've listened to previous shows. I think you have. But so the way this works, I'll just hit you with a bunch of questions. We have about 20 minutes left, so you have to keep your answers somewhat concise. And then at the end, we'll do a word association.
Perfect.
All right. So what is money?
Money is a representation of value created. So it's just an abstraction. It's a measuring tool to say, I provided value and I get to keep this value for a future date, which then I can exchange old value for new value.
If you had to explain Bitcoin to your grandmother, elderly person, what would you say?
It's a decentralized superorganism that's connecting all our brain. No, I would say it's money on the internet.
What is the primary reason why Bitcoin is important or interesting to you?
Because it stands alone. It acts like a superorganism that pays people. So it lives on its own. It eats, sleeps, and breathes on the internet, and it's just wholly new.
What does the sovereign individual mean to you?
It's a fantastic book. Everyone should read it, although the authors drone on a bit. They could have done it in a third the less pages. But to me, it means taking control of every aspect of your life that you can, which is a value beat into me, not literally, but figuratively from my father, which was take personal responsibility for your actions. And if you feel like you're a victim of your circumstances, whether that's true or not, it's a horrible position to be in, and it's a bad perspective. So take responsibility for your own actions. Take responsibility for your home, your neighborhood, expand that sphere as far as you can, and all of a sudden your world will shift. So that's the basis of sovereign individual. Bitcoin is the money side, psychedelics are the mind side. Go work out, do all the things, take responsibility.
Nice. How long after you first heard of Bitcoin did you start learning more and purchase it?
I first heard about it in 2011 or 2012 while I was at Oracle, like standard corporate software sales guy time. And I heard about it because friends were buying drugs on the internet, which I thought was insane that you could do that. I asked the one Bitcoin guy I knew some questions, and once he started telling me about mining and how your computers make Bitcoin and all this crazy stuff, I was like, okay, that's insane. This is not something I need to pay attention to.
Right.
And then I ran into it again in 2014 in Bali. I was ready to learn it.
When were you in Bali in 2014?
July and August.
Okay, because I was there in September, October in 2014, and I went to Hubud, the co-working place there. And I had heard about Bitcoin before, but this was the first. There was a talk there, and I met this girl, and I'd missed the talk, and I was like, yeah, I really want to learn more about this. And she was like, oh, come by tomorrow. I was with my girlfriend. She was like, me and my boyfriend and you two we'll have dinner and we'll talk about Bitcoin, and we'll, I'll set you up with a wallet. We'll exchange some. I was like, oh, sweet. And then she never got, she was like, I'll email you with a time. And she never emailed me. I emailed her back, no response. And I was like, shit, like, fuck, I really wanted to. And it's so funny, man, because like your Bitcoin history, I mean, you look back and think shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? How things would have been differently. But at least in Seminyak, there was a Bitcoin like store. Like it was, people helped you. They set up they set you up with a blockchain .info wallet and all that kind of stuff. So I came across that later in the trip, and I popped in and talked to them a little bit. But yeah, that was my first real exposure too.
Insane. Hubud is where I got the download.
Yeah.
Exact story. But didn't buy. I was on the middle of a 12-month backpacking trip through Europe with my fiance, now wife. And so it just wasn't the time. We were hippie budget backpackers.
Right.
And then it wasn't until 2017, price number going up. What's going on here? I'll buy a little, put some skin in the game. Then all of a sudden, okay, this is what I'm going to dedicate my life to.
I'll give it a whirl. Okay, I'm going to dedicate my life to this thing. It's a pretty quick jump.
Same story as everyone.
Sure,
no
sure.
Eat, no sleep, don't leave the house. Girlfriend's like, hey, why are you still in sweatpants? That kind of thing.
What has been your most effective method of educating people about Bitcoin in conversation or more formally?
I would say the least effective is when I get on my stump and start evangelizing. That I don't think that's ever worked.
Right.
And so the most effective would probably be asking a lot of questions up front and knowing in the back of my mind I want to plant the seed. And so essentially pick the right audience, find friends that trust me and I think would like it if they saw the right picture, ask a bunch of questions, and then toss them a softball and make them think it was their idea. That's probably the most effective way in conversation. Yeah, honestly, it's hard. The real answer is money. You're going to make money. That's right. The most effective way.
Yeah. Another one that I've found, and this is actually perfect corollary to psychedelics, is that you have the experience, you want to run down from the mountaintop and say it's the most amazing thing you've ever encountered, but that doesn't work because people have a negative response to, screaming lunatics. But I put myself out there early on as someone who was interested in this stuff. I didn't hide it, didn't stay in the closet, anything like that. And over time, I just noticed that because people knew me or knew that was something that I was very interested in, at parties, social events and stuff, the odd person would start coming up and being like, can you tell me about like ayahuasca, or can you tell me about this stuff? And then it's great because I just get to have these conversations. I'm not forcing it, and I just get to talk about it. And I think that's probably also one of the things that will happen with Bitcoin is that you put yourself out there as somebody who cares about this stuff or thinks it's meaningful, and people will, slowly but surely come up and be like, hey, can you tell me more? This is kind of fascinating.
I think that's a really good point. It's sort of just establish yourself as a resource, and my office hours are open.
Right.
And whenever the student shows up, the teacher appears. And so, yeah, just put our office hour signs up on our profiles on the internet and, let it be known in a respectful way. And then you have guys like Russell Okong and, cultural icons blabbing about Bitcoin, price is going to go up again, and then people will just show up at your office hours.
Exactly. What movie or song is most related to Bitcoin in your opinion?
Nothing comes to mind except for a TV show. I'm going to forget the name. Altered Carbon. It's sort of like this sci-fi, I think it was on Netflix, one season's out, probably a book as well, where essentially we have our consciousness uploaded in a little device and it lives in our head. And so you can essentially move from body to body by plugging in your consciousness. And it's sort of this dystopian future state where money is also digital like this. And I don't know why it reminded me of that. It's a good show, I thought.
Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is Bitcoin's biggest vulnerability? If not, why not? and we're
I
running short on time. So give
yeah,
me the.
I don't think the idea of Bitcoin could be stopped. I think we're going to have the people's money. Will the current incarnation of the people's money be through to the finish line? If I had to guess, I would say yes. I think the incentives are powerful enough where adopting it is better than killing it. I think the time to kill it has already passed. And so every day it chugs along, every day it gets, you know, underestimated is another day on Bitcoin's side. So the answer, I don't think it can be.
What was your most recent aha or level up in your understanding of Bitcoin?
Mm, I don't know if it's the most recent, but the most profound thing to me in the recent future was from Nick Carter, which was understanding. I think the article was like, it's about the assurances, stupid, or something like that. And it's essentially that it's not Bitcoin is not all these crazy things. What matters is that we trust these certain assurances. There's a fixed supply, it's hard to change, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you can't guarantee those assurances, there's no point to having another blockchain.
What do you think will be Bitcoin's biggest impact on society?
Um, I think it allows humans to create more leverage. And so doing things like colonizing space or any of the big goals like terraforming Mars or preventing climate catastrophe here, I think those type of goals can be achieved when we have real money and the leverage that creates through productive use of capital.
What is the biggest mistake you've made with Bitcoin?
Besides not buying it early, I would say dabbling in the shitcoin casino. If I would have had the wherewithal to pull out at the top, I would be in a better financial position. And so I would say wasting time in altcoins and not understanding how fundamentally useless most of them are.
How do you feel about Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin's creator, being anonymous and the coins that he likely controls?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's a really important part of the story, deifying him in that way. I also think an interesting point here, I forgot where I heard this, was so Satoshi gifted the world his coins, let's assume. Let's assume he never cashes that whatever million we think he has. That doesn't mean Satoshi's not walking around in his private jet petting a fur cat on his evil dictator chair, because those are the coins that we know he has. Let's say he left, he could have bought another million coins at a very cheap price right after that at addresses we don't know about. And so Satoshi could be walking among us. And if he was smart enough to pull off Bitcoin, he was definitely smart enough to have a backup stash.
What have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin?
I think I've been forced to really examine my own political views. And I've oscillated from pretty far left in college days and from a social aspect. And I think I've just been a little bit more exposed to conservative values. And I think I'm much more in the middle, but I also don't think I identify with the either extremes. And so, yeah, it's sort of just re-examining what I find important. And my political views went from giving a shit and trying to change the system from the inside to I take solace and confidence and optimism from the fact that I can put all that political energy, let's say I have a quota for that, into Bitcoin. And I feel that that's actually the best use of my political energy.
I think that's a very common sentiment amongst the Bitcoiners these days. At what price would you permanently sell over 75% of the Bitcoin you hold, assuming no necessity to do so? So how convicted are you?
Assuming there's no catastrophic failures, I can't imagine a situation where I would sell 75%. In my head, I have certain chunks partitioned off for future generations. I could see myself selling some to buy agricultural land in Chile as a backup plan, or I could see some sort of diversification when my percentage of net worth in Bitcoin continues to climb and climb and climb. But 75%, absolutely not.
Yeah. Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years.
5 years, I would say at least 250,000. Tricky part is, where are we in a cycle at that point? It could be 1 million or it could be 70,000. But the average of the 5th year from now, 250,000.
How do you define success?
Getting as close as you can to doing the thing that only you're capable of doing.
Nice.
So think the Venn diagram of you. Get right in the middle of that.
Most impactful book you've ever read?
Books are tricky. It's all about the timing, right? When I'm ready for that information. But I would say right after college, I went down the dystopian future path, like Brave New World, 1984, Utopia, and just kind of devoured those. And those really changed my perspective on what the state is and led to further discovery there. So I'd say that's probably the thing that comes to mind.
What is one question you'd like to see added to this list?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would love to, since we spent a lot of time on psychedelics, I would love to open that door in the Bitcoin community. And if people are comfortable sharing, I would love for that to be brought up. Although you do seem to weave it into all your interviews, so it might be superfluous. But I would say something to do with that in a non-threatening way.
Right. I can't help it, man. It just, it pops up just naturally.
I get it.
Let me see. Okay, last one. What is the most important action that I or anyone listening can take to up our game in your area of expertise? If we want to improve, what's one way that we can do that at this point in time?
So from things that I'm interested in?
Yep.
Like, I would say step one is watch the TED Talk by Paul Stamets, 6 Ways Mushrooms Can Save the World. It's about 20 minutes. If you've already done that or you want a little bit bigger chunk, watch the Joe Rogan with Paul Stamets and then message me with your questions.
Nice. Yeah, the Rogan one with Stamets was so cool. Just, because it's such a long form and they get to really dig into stuff, and hearing Paul's experiences and his formative experiences with mushrooms was really cool. Okay, word association time. I say the word, you tell me the first thing that pops into your head. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Mycologist.
Government.
Nah.
Hash rate.
Climbing.
The individual.
Sovereign.
Security.
Number 1.
Ego.
Useful.
Greed.
Useful.
Stacking sats.
All day.
Fiat currency.
Not as bad as we give it credit to, but it should die anyways. Is that one word?
Yeah. Guns.
I should probably get some.
Mycelium.
Amazing.
Altcoins.
Waste of time.
Socialism.
Vomit.
Pizza.
Carbs.
Family.
Important.
Trump.
Ugh.
Libra.
Interesting.
Gold.
Useful.
And Bitcoin.
The best.
And we've still got 2 minutes to spare. So, Brandon, if you want to let anybody know your destinations, Medium page, website, Twitter, we'll put that in the show notes. But if you want to just let people know how to contact you or interact with your stuff, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Twitter. It's Quittem, BQUITTEM. Otherwise, Brandon Quittem all over the socials. I would say, stay humble, study nature, and stack sats.
Ooh, I like what you did there. Well, man, look, we could talk for hours and hours and hours, and I want to do that sometime. So maybe in 3 to 6 months after your part 4 is put out, we can get together again and dig in further to some of these concepts. But until then, good luck with the writing. I know it's not always easy, and wish you the best, and look forward to connecting in the future.
Appreciate it. Fantastic conversation. Love your podcast. This thing's going to go fast. I can feel it.
Thanks a lot, brother. Take care of yourself.